Good evening, everybody, and glad you could be here back again for Faith and Politics 4. For those of you who don't know, or maybe out in YouTube land or wherever, my name is Pastor David MacKenzie. This is Bay Community Church. We're glad that you can come and see us in the beautiful Comox Valley. If you don't know where we are, and you actually were looking up Chesapeake Bay, Tampa Bay, or some church in San Francisco Bay, and found the wrong spot. So anyway, you are much further north than that, and you're certainly welcome to be here. We're going to be talking today about media, news, and the challenge of church discernment, Christian discernment. So we're just going to head on into this and open up in a word of prayer as we go. So let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you, Lord, for the workday set aside in some respects and the opportunity to just take in this important topic for today. And we pray that you would encourage us, O Lord, and by your Holy Spirit, you'd help us discern the times in which we live. I pray, O Lord, for your help among the people of Issachar, I guess you could say, the people who want to understand more of the times. And so we pray, O Lord, that you might grant us that kind of discerning wisdom, and that we might be able to delve into this particularly important topic and very timely one in a way that is actually refreshing and encouraging to the body and helps us actually grow in maturity and in wisdom. And we pray for your help, and we pray it in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, once again, welcome. Just a little bit of background for those who haven't necessarily been following along. We've been doing various things with respect to the intersection between faith and politics. It's a particular topic that is close to my heart, even if it alienates many. And in that sense, I think it's an important thing to walk through. Our relationship with culture is one that is ongoing. And it's one that we can't really escape from as much as some of us would like to try. So it's something I think that we probably have to examine as it goes along. And we've had several different versions and editions up to now. And I do want to actually mention we've got the potential, at least, it's not absolutely confirmed yet, but the potential for a pretty exciting one, I think, on April's date, which would be just after Christmas. The normal week that we would actually have Faith and Politics is that third Thursday normally. But in this particular case, we'll go the week after Easter because the third Thursday is Maundy Thursday, I believe. So sometime around the 20th or 21st, whatever that Thursday is. And that should be fine. And we'll be entertaining the Association for Reform Political Action, we hope to be. Now, Reform Political Action, the reform there is actually Protestant Reformed. So it's the actual Canadian Reformed Churches and Reformed Churches of America kind of lobby group, you could say. Well, not really. They're almost like a watchdog group. They have an office in Ottawa. It's staffed with lawyers, some ones that have done a very fantastic job already in Christian cases in Canada. And they'll be coming in. They normally take two tours, actually, spring and fall on a given year, and they help their churches keep track of the issues that are going on in either the provincial capitals or the national capital, and keep people informed of the legislation that could impact us directly. They're very, very good at what they do. They've been around now for, got to be 15 years anyway. And now, normally they don't visit Congregationalist churches. They stay amongst their own. But I've been actually pleading with them and begging them for years. And they finally got so sick of me, like that widow in the parable, they decided to agree. So they'll be coming along, actually, Lord willing, around the April 20th mark. And we can actually listen in on what they're telling, actually, their Reform followers as well, in the Dutch Reformed, Canadian Reformed, and Reformed Church of America's types of milieu. And they'll get us up to speed on the things that are happening in Ottawa as well as in Victoria too. And I think it'll be actually a very interesting time from a slightly different perspective, but from an agency that knows what they're talking about. So if you want to look up ARPA Canada, you can look at them online, and they do a terrific job of keeping track for us in terms of what's happening in the places where power is being exercised, and the House of Commons among them. So just bear that in mind, and it should be a good one. I think those are anything I will say at this point. There's one more potential kind of curveball, and that is that the next slotted Thursday in March is actually St. Patty's Day. So I might try to encourage actually my Ironman group to maybe give up their Wednesday night, and we'll bump it to actually the Wednesday, so that maybe the next one will not be on a Thursday night but be on a Wednesday, just so you know. All right, I think that's most of the things that are up for grabs at this point. Let's head in to the topic of media, news, and the challenge of discernment. Now, I do want to mention straight off the bat that this topic could go on and on. It could get away on you. Because there's no end of source material for bizarre kind of moments in media, you could say. And so in this sense, I wanted to keep it relatively concise to a certain angle, looking at some of the ways in which the excesses of media could impact Christian discernment. Okay? So in that sense, news media specifically. Obviously, there's lots of different forms of media, and we're not going into the celebrity zone. We are staying in the realistic zone as much as possible. So, but that makes it all the more, I think, significant and even serious, because we're covering things that people are serious about. And so if there are troubles brewing in the things that people are serious about, then it is a problem, theoretically. And I think we'll see a little bit of that going on. And we'll also talk a little bit about what media probably serves in terms of the mind of God. Because I do have a little bit of a theory around that. I'm not trying to put words in God's mouth, but I do have a basic belief that in a secular sense, the media is supposed to act like a prophetic watchman would act in the church or in a nation state that was a theocratic nation state. The media is supposed to be that responsible. So it's supposed to be responsible to tell truth in the public, even if power is wrong. So they have a very high calling, media. So in this, I hope you understand, I'm not trying to trounce on the office of media. I think it's very, very important. I think, though, that there are distortions in a contemporary sense, and of course the human factor is always the human factor, and as the phrase goes, sin gets in, it gets into everything. So in reality, we'll see that dynamic for sure. But when it comes to actually what media, I think, idealistically is intended to represent in a free society, its function is meant to be fairly prophetic in that sense, the truth-telling agency in the public square, even willing to actually call power into account. And in a way, one of the high ground moments maybe for media in that type of understanding was that, everyone was all abuzz in the mid-1970s, as I can recall, even as a young person, about the impact that actually good journalism had on Watergate, for example, in the United States. And it was almost like a high water mark of the respect for investigative journalism. And in some respects, you could even argue, as difficult as it might have been for certain partisan groups, namely Republicans, it actually is a sign of health that a president, any sitting president, should be actually called into account for abuses in law. Because as I've discussed with various small groups, the idea that law is above us, because we spoke about this on the opening session of Faith and Politics, the idea that law is king, or lex rex, and it actually holds everybody in account, be they actually the smallest of the small or the most powerful of the most powerful, is actually a healthy thing. It is healthy to actually be able to call a prime minister into account, or for that matter, the person who's working flipping burgers at McDonald's or something like that. I mean, all of us need accountability, and it's a sign of health, actually, that Watergate should have actually looked at the presidency and said, that's not good enough. Now, I think we've fallen away a little bit since that time on a number of levels. There's been a number of issues where I'm not so sure the push is, in a general sense, a moral outrage or a moral push is there to say that's not good enough for the office of whatever. But I think that may say more about us in our generation than it might have earlier generations. So that's going to be one of the things we can take a look at too straight away. So I'm going to move forward at this point on my monitor and also here, if that does it. Yeah, excellent. That's working well. Well, I know this is slightly out of context, but at the same time, I think it is a good way to begin. How beautiful on the mountains are the feet of those who bring good news. Isaiah 52:7. Now, it's kind of interesting, isn't it, that Isaiah is a Prophet, okay? So it's important, the prophetic literature is really, really interesting from the standpoint of its presentation in the public square of truth and the importance in this case of good news, but obviously if there's really, really bad news that you need to know, it's the prophets would tell that too, okay? So let's be honest about that. People like Isaiah, people like Jeremiah, people like Amos and John the Baptist, they were quite prepared to tell you the bad news too, but they were also willing to say how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news, who tell of salvation. And so in some respects, that, like I say, there is a kind of a tie-in between the prophetic office in a religious Christian, Judeo-Christian sense, to the secular office of the media, because they're both supposed to be truth tellers in the public. Now if I can get this to go. There we go. And so this is actually just a wrap up, I guess, in a way, but it does include a therefore. In a secular society, the role of the media at its best, okay, at its best, and I know things don't often run at their best, okay, but it's intended to be prophetic. That means, in this case, not to necessarily be making, predictions of what might happen. I don't mean the word prophecy in that sense, but rather the other side of that coin, to be a public truth teller, even when confronting power. Okay? And therefore, the cultural situation becomes more dire, like the public situation becomes more dangerous, not merely when the media becomes politicized, because that's only the beginnings of it, but when it loses sight instead of all truth and objective standards, and worst of all becomes the general enforcer of government or corporate power, like when that happens, we are in a serious situation. And I think if we were to sit down together in a circle and ask ourselves the question, do we see evidence of the media becoming politicized? We laugh, right? Because yes, I think we do. I think I do, that type of thing. Do we see evidence of it losing a sense of what truth is and objective standards of reality? Yes, I think you can see that too. And I do want to pause there for just a second and say, philosophically, in our generation, when there's been a lot of talk, once again, and I mentioned this before, when there's been a lot of talk about such things as the kind of subjective understanding of truth that you will find within the postmodern philosophy, where my truth is not the same as your truth and whatever. When you have that type of philosophy that's also in play inside the culture, you will have a general erosion of what we would say is objective truth. We might not be able, every one of us, if some of us are colorblind, to see the color yellow on the screen and say that is yellow, objectively speaking, because we have varying subjective understandings of what some of our senses are telling us. That's fair. But when it comes to the moral issues of describing what is objectively wrong, or whether or the existence of God is an objective truth or simply a mirage, that type of argument. Well, it is an objective truth versus kind of opinion sort of thing, or at least it's the kind of thing that you have to agree on or disagree on clearly and cleanly. No, I don't believe in God. Yes, I do believe in God. There is a God we can debate, but when it comes to certain things, is murder wrong? There is a kind of objective decision we have to come to understand. If we don't, there's mayhem. There's potential chaos at stake. And so sometimes I think, when we are caught up in a postmodern generation that is debating subjective standards of truth only and is not looking for or even trying to find an objective truth, then our media is going to be under that much more pressure. And so is our science, by the way. Because if you can't actually say what objectively you're seeing through a microscope, then your science is done. And so the longer we sit there and kind of fiddle with this kind of postmodern subjectivism, the more in trouble I think society is capable of becoming. Because after a while, we won't know what we're dealing with. We can't even agree on it. So that becomes a real problem for a number of things. The media as well. Okay. And then lastly here, worst of all, when media becomes the enforcer of government or corporate power. in a free society, you should never reach that point. But of course, I think there are tendencies where we can honestly say, well, even if it's not exclusively so, there are these threats that are happening in our midst, that it looks like mainstream media in Canada is more significantly enamored with those that are in the political authority or those cultural trends that are dominant rather than with ones that are not. So that can present a significant challenge to us at this particular point because Christianity is a minority religion, after all. I mean, as many people as confess that they believe in God, you know, it looks like it's a majority, but when it really comes down to walking it out with Christ, it's a minority. It probably always has been a minority, except in very rare circumstances. So that's just important for us to bear in mind realistically ourselves. So I'm going to go on in this case to a brief list of media sins. And now, you know, we'll be booking here an hour, sort of an hour, 2 days, 1 week, I don't know. It would never end if we were to list all the things that we saw. But I do want to actually just list some categories that I think maybe in some respects they go from the grand and the grotesque right down to the really subtle. And it's really the really subtle that I want to actually take a little bit more time to talk about tonight because, you know, very few people can be fooled by a $3 bill, but a lot of people can be fooled by something that's very good as a counterfeit. And so, you know, when the enemy works in the midst of worldly days, you know, he's not dealing in cheap counterfeits. He's dealing with distortions that are very subtle sometimes. And I think, you know, we need to be discerning once again to be able to detect some of these. So I'm going to discuss some of the sins I've seen, I guess you could say, in media of late. And sometimes some of this is very of late, like within the last few days. I mean, honestly, this has been a gold mine in the last 2 weeks when it comes to media and the things that we've witnessed. You know, it's been just flabbergastingly good on one level if you want to do stuff like this, but disappointing if you're just watching from afar and hoping for better. So in this case, here we go. There we go. Okay, and I'd like to say, note bene, you know, just note this as well. Note well, one reality continues to be a consistent factor in everything I'm listing here. Pretty much. It actually, politics is at the root of some of this. You know, the interpretation of power has an impact on what media does and says. And so there's always like, my problem is that there's a political lens here that I'm certainly looking through, but shockingly, even if I didn't have that lens, I would still have to conclude that there's an awful lot of media things going on that have their root in an ideological war of some kind, into a political, on a political front of some kind. So that's something to bear in mind as well, just as we start. Okay, number one, how about this? This is one of the more subtle ones, but it's obvious if you know it, I guess, if you can detect it, is the calculated silence. Okay? It is a well-known fact that if media ignores an issue, it's less likely to actually gain oxygen on the cultural or the public level. So one of the tactics that is probably more common than we know is simply the choice not to report on things. And it could be called a calculated silence because in some ways it may not be, but could be. It could be ignorance in some situations where the reporters just are not seeing what other people in the public might be seeing. But it could also be calculated. And I suspect in some cases it is, where editorial decisions are being made where it simply does not make the evening news because it's deemed by some to be not newsworthy, even though there might be some within this very audience that would beg to differ, and I mean really beg to differ. But the calculated silence is a tactic of the modern media to keep things down. One of the things I think is an obvious example of this in the United States is the March for Life. Now, this year, amazingly, was something of an exception. There were mainstream media channels in the United States that covered the March for Life, principally because this is the year that the Supreme Court of the United States will finally discuss Roe versus Wade after almost 50 years of legal, second guessing, I guess you could say. And a lot of people feel that Roe versus Wade needs to go back to the court in order to be discussed further in terms of where in the world this constitutional argument for privacy became a right to abort children. So that will be discussed, and it already has been discussed. I think the decision is meant for June, I think, and somewhere in there. So you can understand why media, knowing and anticipating that this is coming forward, that Roe versus Wade theoretically could fall in June with a conservative court in the United States. That's why they want to maybe pay a little bit more attention to the March for Life that occurs annually every January. But traditionally and historically for the last 5-10 years, that's not been the case at all. You would have 100,000, 150,000 marchers in January in Washington, D.C., and yet the mainstream networks would not actually acknowledge that it was existing. And one of the largest marches that is annual in the United States, because there's not just that march, there's also a corresponding march in several other cities, including San Francisco. That's a fairly large one that usually gets tens of thousands as well. And yet it was remarkably kept on the down low. What you might say, or what you might experience instead on a mainstream network, is all of a sudden they'll have a guest coming on to talk about Planned Parenthood. So in other words, they take the opportunity to talk about abortion when the March for Life was on, as a kind of, we don't agree with you, and we're basically going to do our own thing and not bother reporting at all. And this is sort of something that is not uncommon, even in Canada. The March for Life in Canada takes place in May, because that's the anniversary of the omnibus bill in Ottawa that passed it in 1969 that allowed for it. So it takes place then. But even then, sometimes there'd be 20,000 people in Ottawa. Wouldn't necessarily be talked about that much on the media at all. I know that locally, when I participated in the March for Life in Edmonton, we'd probably get 3,000 maybe out. Very difficult to get any real local oxygen on that. There wasn't really a lot happening. By and large, I think that the word was out that we just don't necessarily reference it, and maybe it'll go away. Well, it doesn't really go away, but there you go. And I think a lot of Christians and others got used to the fact that, we're going to do this regardless of whether the media shows up. It's not really about the media anyway, although drawing attention to a problem is certainly one of the goals. But certainly I think it had reached a certain level of disfavor culturally that the media just really wouldn't want to spend an awful lot of time on it. And because if they did, I think they run the risk of maybe having some hearts changed and minds changed about it. And therefore it was kind of not something that was wanting to be done. So the calculated silence is a significant issue. Now this is the one that's the most patently obvious, but we can debate how many forms it takes. But the outright lie is out there, okay? And this is also when we can conclude that media has simply succumbed to a certain level where it is mere propaganda. Now you'd like to think that would be rare. And so I'm not going to comment on anything relatively recently with respect to this particular sin, if you want to call it that. Well, it is a sin. But I do want to point your attention to an incredibly crass example of it. How many of you were still alive in 2003? Oh, well, obviously, many of you were. But in that case, there was the Iraq War. And the Iraq War had this interesting guy named Mohammed Saeed al-Sahaf, who was the Minister of Media and Foreign Affairs from Iraq at the time. And he became famous. He was dubbed as Baghdad Bob by some, but he was also known, I think more interestingly, as Minister Magoo. After the cartoon character that's visually kind of impaired and is not really looking where he needs to look all the time. Because basically there were filmed broadcasts of him in his own studio saying that basically his troops of Iraq had won a great victory, when you could actually hear combat noises in the background of coalition bomb strikes, tank strikes that were right in his neighborhood. At one point in time, apparently, the coalition and American forces were actually 200 yards from where he was while he's broadcasting a great victory. for Iraq, and yet, all the noises he's conveniently ignoring, and meanwhile the coalition knows that they're not very far away from his broadcast studios. Well, he was so cartoon-like and so incredibly out of touch in some sense that's why he got the name of Mr. Magoo, and it was or Minister Magoo, and it was one of those moments where everyone who tuned in could look at this man and say, that is just a pack of lies. That is just spinning lies right off the top of your head, and you know it, and it's propaganda, pure and simple. And yet he went with great gusto on behalf of the regime to say what he wanted to say. And maybe I should underscore that phrase, on behalf of the regime. Now, when you say things like that, are you saying that the media is politicized? Yes, I am. In a clear sense like that, when you're simply lying for governance in order to keep up a certain front and maybe keep up morale, you've reached a point of maximum politicization of your media where it really doesn't have any objectivity to it anymore. It's simply in the pocket of whoever is in power, is being used as a tool to misdirect, mislead, and misrepresent reality. So that is hopefully the one that we should all be able to spot, but sometimes it's not that easy. Sometimes it's more subtle than that. Here's an interesting issue that's a little bit more subtle as well, and this comes from fairly recently, and I'm going to call this deflection. Now, admittedly, do I know this took place? No. But at the same time, is it quite possible it took place? Am I suspicious? Yes. Okay. When the massive Truckers' Freedom Convoy began to get going in British Columbia on its way back east, on its way to Ottawa, CBC Vancouver, ironically, on the same weekend, decided to run a story about another truckers' protest on that same weekend, a smaller protest that was actually protesting BC road conditions. Okay? So they went ahead with that story and didn't really cover at all of what was beginning to brew in terms of this quest to get to Ottawa with the Freedom Convoy. And on the one hand, the interesting thing is both stories were legitimate. There was a truckers' convoy headed to Ottawa. There was a truckers' protest with respect to BC road conditions. Both of them were accurate. So you can't sort of say, in this case, the news was being inaccurate, or it was lying to you, or it was propaganda, or it couldn't come anywhere near that. What they did was they chose to emphasize one to the distraction of the other. It was, in some respects, I'd like to think that it was actually, that I'm not just speculating here, they deliberately chose to emphasize the smaller over the larger because the implications of the larger might have reflected something a little bit more that they wanted on the down low, that they actually would have preferred not to cover it if at all possible. Like I say, can I prove that? No, I can't. But it is kind of curious that even though these cases are both true, there was a deliberate choice being made in the newsrooms at CBC to cover one and not necessarily cover the other, which is curious when you think about it. So that's what I would call deflection, where you might take two similar stories, but you'll run the one that pleases you more, as opposed to the one that pleases you less on some level. All right? Now this has got a big word attached to it. This is obfuscation. That just means to make things obscure, to muddy the waters, I guess you could say. Now I put the question of challenging media cases to a friend of mine in Alberta, who is a doctorate in political science. He's a great friend. And I asked him what was one of the things that he found most disturbing recently about media. And he said this, for him, one of the most worrying aspects of media was the recent willful misrepresentation of the facts in the recent conversion therapy debate in Canada. Mainstream media sided with the proponents of the legislation who connected the therapy with, of all things, torture and even electroshock. And I saw articles where they were saying, we may defend, pastoral counseling, but we're not defending electroshock. Nobody does that. In fact, it's been illegal for years. But in this case, there was a deliberate connection to something that actually muddied the waters, so that even if you tried as a Christian pastor to say, hey, listen, we're a lot more responsible than that. We're not into psychological torture when it comes to counseling people of same-sex attraction or anything like this. But none of these things were necessarily given fair play within many of the mainstream newspapers. They would simply concentrate on the people who were the most upset with the status quo and wanted to pursue this whole notion of canceling, I guess you could say, the therapy, the conversion therapy. And ironically, of course, that is exactly what happened. The Canadian Parliament passed it without debate, and the Senate virtually the same. And as a net result, as I've mentioned before, like you can now have Christian teachers, Christian parents, theoretically, Christian pastors certainly, up for a potential 2-year to 5-year prison sentence for simply talking about the biblical definitions of sexuality and identity. And so we've had a flip-flop. And so these are kind of, it's kind of sad when I think about it, the fact that the public debate could have been far more robust and ought to have been far more robust. But all the prophets, it's like they fell asleep, and the media, being prophets, also fell asleep at the switch. They only covered, in a way, the dominant narrative. They never covered a lot. They didn't. There was no attempt by. I know of no pastor who was approached by the media and said, can you comment on this from your conservative evangelical persuasion? There probably were the odd cases. I can understand if some people say, no thanks, because if you go in to talk to CBC and CTV, sometimes you're not given the advantage. I can tell you that. You're going into the lion's den, that's for sure. And there are some people who know that lion's den image. And believe me, going in to talk to the CBC is probably no good. And I've done it. So I know a little bit about that. Not much, but a little. But anyway, that's what I would call obfuscation, where you're basically muddying the waters. You're not representing actually the fullness of the debate at all, and you know it. You make a willing choice not to, and that's kind of shameful. This one you know quite well, I'm sure. Most people would know this one quite well. The hyperbolic headline. Don't fall for this, okay? It's out there. Some of the worst forms, of course, are in clickbait at the bottom of the news page or at the bottom of the web page. Some of these crazy things, a woman from Courtney earns $7,000 a month, that type of thing. No, there is no woman from Courtney. There are people earning money, I'm sure, but that's not what the actual posting is about. So it gets kind of raw when it's advertising and stuff like that, but unfortunately, there are examples within standard media where there is this problem of the hyperbolic headline. It just goes over the top and doesn't even represent the article anymore. That's what I mean by hyperbolic, is that you read the article and you go, the headline had no connection or very little connection with it, or something along that line. Like, have you ever seen a guy overblow a YouTube headline where he basically says, watch the MP from Mississauga tear apart, and defeat, Justin Trudeau in the Commons. And you watch it and you kind of go, I don't see any knockout punch. There wasn't anything close to a knockout punch. I was hoping there would be a knockout punch. But, you often see those kinds of things. They're completely inaccurate. They often are just added for the sake of getting you there, even when the content kind of never fails to disappoint. But there are cases like that, even in the standard media that should be more responsible. Like, for example, take this. This happened very recently in British Columbia. There was an anti-vaccine mandate protest taking place at a British Columbia school in the Okanagan Valley. And the CTV headline in this case referred to this person giving a racist tirade. That's what the word that was in the headline. So I'm kind of going, well, that's kind of uncomfortable, but I will read the article because I want to see exactly what the form of this racist tirade is. Okay, so anyway, you get the picture in terms of the setup. Now, here's the thing. While the headline cited racist tirade, the article contained an RCMP statement referencing profanities with racist undertones. And the video accompanying the story was inconclusive as to what was even said. Because in some respects, they were so busy sort of like muting the odd word that was profanity, they didn't get a sense of what the person was even saying at this point. And the article actually failed to even ask the RCMP. Like, the media failed to ask the RCMP, what do you mean undertones? Like, what does that even mean technically? And from a legal standpoint, I mean, I've never seen somebody charged with undertones, of any kind. Have you, basically hate undertones. What does that mean? Like, either there's something going on there or there isn't. Which is it? I mean, we normally don't have charges that have to do with innuendo. Charged with innuendo, Bob could serve 10 years in prison. We don't tend to go with that. Either it said what it said, or it doesn't say what it said. Like, one way or the other. But you can't just simply say there's a tirade of racist remarks and then just say, well, it had some undertones. So here's an example where CTV, this is one of the big boys, and even there, the hyperbolic headline is driving the actual traffic to the article. Because I'm reading the article, I'm going to go, well, gee, a tirade, and it's racist. Well, let's go see this person who is supposedly that. And finding out once again, well, it's a little bit overstated. The police might do charges. Well, we'll see whether they can get away with it, Because honestly, in the court of law, if you do not meet with certain speech elements of actual hatred or actual threat or actual incitement, it's not a charge that actually sticks. And thankfully so, because you can't just prosecute people on the basis of innuendo or what isn't said or what might be semi-said or something like that. That's not how law works. So I don't think this is a media actual article that was helping anyone in terms of understanding the present crisis or doing anything other than maybe stoking bigotry in the general culture. Hate to say it, but that could be something that's operative there. I'd hope it would be otherwise, but there it is. Okay, how about this? The conveniently slow retraction. Whoops. Am I going the wrong way? Is that the convenient? No, I'm still on hyperbole. There we go. Did I press that backwards or something? Anyway. Okay, so the conveniently slow retraction. This is another thing where it's almost like that expression, you're well, I mean, it's not a great comparison, but the phrase, damned by faint praise, where it's the absence of things that are the problem. Well, the absence of a retraction in this situation can be damaging. And in this particular situation, what was happening here was recorded, and it was, in this case, it's the New York Times, the biggest of the big, right? Okay, during the January 6, 2021 Capitol riot, the New York Times reported that a police officer had been killed by rioters who struck his head using a fire extinguisher. Okay? Maybe some of you even heard that report. This was not true, actually. In fact, early police reports denied any trauma to the officer, and it's later discovered that the officer actually died of internal causes at that time. I mean, he died in the hospital later, but, obviously he went into medical duress at some particular point in time and passed away, some hours later. But there was never any evidence he'd been struck by a fire extinguisher or anything. Okay, so they established that fairly early on with the police reports that that's actually not what happened. The New York Times did not withdraw that piece or actually do a retraction for 5 weeks. Which when you say, a 24-hour news cycle is like it's the way of things, right? So when you keep things on your website saying that this, in error, saying that this was basically the cause of the death when that is not what happened at all, that's kind of a willful piece of nonsense. And there's no way in the world a retraction should be waiting for 5 weeks before it finally occurs. Why did that happen? Well, it causes one to speculate, doesn't it? The New York Times was not necessarily a fan of the older administration of Mr. Trump's. And so therefore, making the Capitol folks who supported him look bad or worse or what have you might be something that might keep them from doing the retraction that they know that responsibly they should do. So therefore, there you have this situation where it wasn't just forgotten, because there were people saying, hey, retract, retract. This did not happen, and it did not happen. It took 5 weeks before they finally did. I don't think the Times looked good at that particular incident, and it just shows you in some respects that even the biggest of the big need to be held to account to some extent. Yes, here's the other thing. Monopolizing uniformity. Okay, I gotta just talk a little bit around this, because there are other things in play as well. Not just what's on screen. The reality is that a lot of corporate sectors tend to go in the direction of monopoly. The successful players that keep getting more and more successful, they keep making more money, they don't know what to do with their money, so they buy out their competitors. It's just kind of a natural thing. So over the course of time in any particular industry or any particular market or technological field or what have you, there is a growth of corporations towards monopolizing. I heard a statistic when I was doing the research here that in the 1980s there were probably 50 media firms that were all vying with each other in the United States. It's down to 5 now of the big ones, and there are minor players. Some would say, some of the players like 6 and 7 are getting pretty large too. Okay, I don't dispute that, but the reality is when things have been cut by basically, into 1/10 of what they were, there's a strong monopolizing tendency that happens. Now, monopolizing tendencies have their issues, don't they? If you were involved in a company coal town and you had to rent your apartment from the company coal mine and had to go to the company store to buy your products with the company's money that you'd earned from the mine, and it's their store and they can charge whatever they want because there's no competition, pretty soon you find yourself with every shovel of coal that you're shoveling, you're actually behind every day. You're actually going more and more into debt. And that was, one of the classic sort of problems with monopolistic coal towns, that they even wrote songs, like 16 tons about it, right? So, there's a thing where monopolies just actually benefit the strong. They benefit the strong. So there's a benefit in busting up monopolies. Well, there is a monopolizing tendency within the media, as I've kind of alluded to. And the danger, of course, with all monopolies is that you get a control issue that is very difficult to escape from, and there's very little alternative to run to. And of course, as media becomes a little bit more monolithic, the same dangers begin to show themselves with respect to our own particular culture and context. There's always room for more players, and in some respects, I certainly would encourage people to have a good broad sense of what they're looking at media-wise on the web. If you, just out of curiosity, how many people here know of True North News? Okay, so we have almost all, not quite. Well, that's a conservative news site that will often give you a perspective that you won't get necessarily with the Toronto Star. How many people read the Toronto Star? Okay, well, there you go. I don't know why anyone would, except to go and laugh or something. But, it's not that there's a serious media work going on there. But it is highly politicized. Everybody knows it's highly politicized. People have called it the Red Star for years. It's a smack on its ideology. And you can see, even down to this day, it is significantly different. Well, it's good to be able to read the Toronto Star from time to time. It's also good to be able to read True North News. It's good to read Rebel Media from time to time. It's good to actually read the Globe and Mail and then go to the National Post to check the same story against each other. These are actually tactics that are good to do. And just like Soviet citizens and Soviet Christians, got used to sort of reading between the lines of news agency tasks and things like that. I think that Canadian Christians probably could use some skills in the same regard to navigate some of the media waters that we face today. They're not quite as bad as that, but who knows when things get really monopolized what they're going to look like in some respects. And you know, I also want to think that what I put on the screen here is also operating, and that's fair. The advent of social media has managed to accelerate the dangerous speed of distorted messaging. I mean, you can go around the world 10 times with a lie in about like that now, right? And nobody's really surprised by that. But as a consequence, and here's the thing, as a consequence, corporate media, the one that's more publicly in the public eye and is therefore accountable to the public on a little bit more, in a little bit greater way, may exhibit almost like an overcompensation towards controlling the message, because they're so scared of being either associated with the extremes of social media or something like that. But unfortunately, that controlling mechanism can create its own issues too. I'm struck by the fact that like even in schools, for example, 20 years ago in schools, if there was an issue that happened with a local news thing, let's say a pipe burst and you had to let the kids home early on Thursday and the school is going to be closed for several days until the plumbing work could be done. Well, you might get interviewed by the local newspaper as what to have happen, and it would be the principal or his or her designate that would actually talk to the local media about what happened. Well, these days, that's no longer the case. Principals don't talk, vice principals don't talk. The actual respective boards have one public relations officer charged with communications to the media. So you don't necessarily even get if there's a problem at your local school, you don't necessarily get the school's opinion on the problem. You get somebody from the board who's been designated as a communications officer to handle those kinds of things. I simply point that out because what you can see is that over time everywhere, there has been a centralization of the message. Because people do not want misunderstandings unnecessarily to go viral on them when they've made a mistake, you know. So they're very, very intentional about controlling the message. But unfortunately, that intentionality creates its own dangers on a certain level. So I think it's just something we have to be sympathetic to and yet mindful of at the same time, if that makes sense. Yeah. So there is a legal safeguard as well to controlling the message, because of course if you're being chased by a highly litigious culture or watched by a highly litigious culture, you never know when something that you said it by accident is going to result in a court case against you. This too is a damaging thing about our society and what it's come to. On the one hand, you need a certain amount of case studies in order to make good case study law. So on the one hand, you need a certain amount of legal suits to be able to establish the proper legal precedents so you can protect the weak. On the other hand, if you are simply met with a tsunami of legal cases every time somebody burps when they shouldn't, then there's a problem in a society sense that everyone's trying to hide from. And that shows in some ways that we've got a broad cultural problem as well when we're just suing everybody at the drop of a hat, you know, that type of thing. Right? So there's an interesting thing there. But all these are kind of factors in wanting to safeguard one's reputation or one's institutional reputation by having a centralized communicative strategy, central media control, in essence. Now, I'm going to play this very famous video here, and some of you may saw it, but maybe not heard it quite well. But this is a good example of uniform and controlled messaging that was on about 3 or 4 years ago on the web. It was done by actually Deadspin, their analysis of a broadcast group in the United States called Sinclair. Okay, so I don't know whether the headline on the bottom of the original thing is all that necessary or all that relevant, but it is interesting to listen to how this goes.
Balanced journalism that CS4 News produces.
Website Deadspin posted this montage last week of Sinclair news anchors reading the same script word for word. The message expresses concern for what they call
the troubling trend of
irresponsible, one-sided news stories
played in our country. The editorial isn't overly partisan, but reads like something that Donald Trump would agree with.
You could pick a reporter, a Baltic reporter ideally. Real news, not fake news.
And sure enough, the president tweeted his support of Sinclair right afterwards. But journalists around the country and elsewhere were less supportive.
I think Sinclair is probably the most dangerous company in all of our American media.
Prompting a question from many. Why didn't the anchors who didn't want to read it refuse or quit?
This was a disgrace across the board on the part of the journalists involved.
That led a team at Bloomberg News to investigate. They found many of the Sinclair employees are bound by an unusual employment contract. Jordan Holman was one of the Bloomberg reporters on that story.
So Jordan, let's talk about the contract first. What's in it that's unusual?
For Sinclair employees, it can be very expensive to leave. There's a clause in their contract that lays out the terms of if they quit. So it's called liquidated damages. And in those liquidated damages, it says if you leave before your contract is over, the company's able to charge you 40% of your annual compensation before you leave.
I've never heard of anything like that. I've been in this business a while. I've heard of non-compete clauses. I've even heard of people having to give up severance. I've never heard of people actually having to remit their salary, 40%.
Right. So when I was speaking to lawyers about this clause, they said for ordinary workers, they might never see that. You know, they might never see it in any of their contracts. But in broadcast, it's more common among on-air anchors, where it would be expensive for a company to have to train and find new talent to bring in. What's unusual with Sinclair is that they had some people who never appeared on TV having to sign that clause.
So it actually does sound like a way of enforcing this notion that if we write it and we want you to say it, you have no choice but to potentially default on your mortgage.
Yeah, some employees did feel like they were kind of being held hostage. You know, it's an expensive thing to leave, and if you're in a local market and you want to be a journalist, there might not be another place to go. So they had to weigh, financial penalties with also other job prospects.
As you mentioned, many of these stations are local markets, and yet, as we saw just a moment ago, it was creating national headlines. They were talking about it on all the cable networks. We saw MSNBC talking about it. We saw, Joe Scarborough talking about it. How is Sinclair reacting to the attention it's gotten, not just to this dictate that they all have to say the same thing, but the revelation that many of them are doing it because they don't see any choice?
So it's important to note that Sinclair is the largest broadcaster in the U.S. They have a huge reach. So they have many journalists all over the country. And their stance right now is that they are just promoting, making sure that there is media integrity, that there's not fake news. But inside, some employees feel that they don't want to work here anymore, that the political conservative lean is getting in the way of the factual journalism that they want to do.
We did hear this week that one person has stood up at one of these stations and said, I quit, didn't really want to be associated with all that's fallen out of this. But do you have a sense that others will follow suit or be bound by this contract?
Yes, my colleagues and I, we spoke to one man who quit. He was working in a Florida station, and he left before his contract was over. And one fear that a lot of Sinclair employees have is that they would need to hire a lawyer. They will be sued if they actually leave. And that was the case with this man. The company sued him for leaving early. So that's just one thing that everyone's weighing. Like, will I have to hire a lawyer? That does not come cheap. And what's kind of my next steps?
What an interesting finding in these contracts. Thanks for talking about it.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm going to call it right now. I think I found the single biggest productivity hack of 2021. It's this.
Hate the commercials. And of course, now it'll take you back, won't it? Now you won't be able to get back properly. Hopefully you can come back to the actual site where they show the synchronized speech by the actual anchors involved. If you could take us back there even, Michael.
Sorry, you want to go back to the video?
Yeah, if you can. That was just a commercial, I think.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry that actually was there.
We're extremely proud
So
of the quality
right after her interview.
Where it would be expensive for a company to pause.
So
Unless there might be
local obstruction.
make eyes some that in a Florida station, and he left before his contract, man.
Okay, it looks
What an
like
interesting finding
actually we had the wrong
we're
link
talking
there. Was that from the embedded link or was that from the actual link in the email? Because I think there's
Tonight,
been
the
some
biggest owner
confusion.
of local TV stations in the country fighting back.
Yeah. let's see. There should be one that actually it goes directly in. There's one with an interview and one without, but yeah, let's try that one.
Hi, I'm Fox San Antonio's Jessica Headley.
And I'm Ryan Wolf.
Our greatest responsibility is to serve our treasure.
Where do you want me to go?
Yeah, just let her roll.
Valley communities, the El Paso, Las Cruces communities,
Eastern Iowa communities.
Mid-Michigan communities.
we are extremely proud of the quality, balanced journalism that CBS 4 News produces.
But
Plaguing our country.
The sharing of biased and false news has become all too common on social media. More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
The sharing of biased and
False news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, democracy.
This is extremely dangerous to our 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 democracy.
This is extremely
dangerous to our democracy.
This is
This is extremely dangerous to
our democracy.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy. This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
Okay. I think that being too monolithic is extremely dangerous to our democracy. It's quite a fascinating thing to watch that kind of degree of coordination, and yet there it is. Now, just a few interesting qualifiers here. In that first interview, you heard the actual reporter saying that Sinclair is the largest in the country, the largest network in the country of broadcast things. I believe that is only true if you measure it in a certain way, because it's certainly not the largest with respect to cash flow. It's not the largest with respect to nationwide influence. It is one of the largest in terms of its local regional news conglomerate type of broadcasters. You'll notice there, which is fascinating too, it's really fascinating. If you just look on the screen, you can see that there are within this Sinclair network Fox affiliates, NBC affiliates, ABC affiliates, CBS affiliates, and so some of the times where you say, well, the mainstream media of CBS and NBC and ABC, they're a little bit more left, and Fox News is a little bit more right. And under this particular banner of the broadcast conglomerate, they're all under the same regional control. Even though they're supposed to be different, from a lot of people's perceptions of what they would talk about, they aren't all that different that we might think. There's actually sort of layers upon layers, But the funny thing is that here's some true confessions. Deadspin is a pretty left-wing organization. They wanted to make Sinclair look bad here. It just so happened that Sinclair walked right into their webs, because in some ways Sinclair did this dumb tactic of having every actual anchor read off the same script without any ability to actually interpret it for the local audience. So it makes Sinclair look really, really bad. But the funny thing is that Deadspin is actually identifying what was then the 6th largest consortium of channels in the United States. It's now number 7 because it couldn't actually do a particular purchase of another network that it wanted to do. It went to Nexstar, and Nexstar became number 6. But there's 5 others above them, including Viacom and Disney and several others that are much, much larger and have much more influence still. And yet the irony is that in some of those situations like Fox, here's a Fox affiliate working for Sinclair, but the Fox also is a large consortium by itself. So there's multiple layers of potential authority here, each of which I think we have to understand is a potential player in the news that we are hearing. So it's important, I think, to take a look at some more independent media in general, because obviously even in a so-called conservative network here, there's a great range of affiliate stations that may or may not be conservative at all. So this is an interesting thing. So if this was some kind of gigantic conspiracy of conservatism, I don't suppose that CBS and NBC and ABC would be included, because ABC and Disney is one of the major drivers of things that socially are pretty left-wing in the United States. So there's these layers upon layers is what I'm saying. But obviously in this particular situation, here you have a controlled messaging directive from even a supposedly conservative group. That's probably not that cool in some respects. You need to be aware of that. I don't for the life of me think that others aren't capable. In fact, in some things I have read, there's been the odd remark that I couldn't actually get a good footnote for you guys today, but that the fact that there may be only a limited number of actual areas that are writing the news. Certain networks may have their writing concentrated in smaller spots. And you think that the local newsroom is actually where the writing is done. Not necessarily true. So there's more centralizing tendencies here than we probably can list, and that can be a monopolizing danger. That's really what I'm saying here. Yeah. So let's move on, I guess, to point 8, I think it is now. If I can move it. There we go. How about designed ambiguity? This form of subtle spin, this is almost like obfuscation in a way. It makes the reader or the viewer incorrectly associate two true things that have little to do with one another, taking advantage of ambiguities in order to capitalize upon, or in worst case scenario, to discredit something. Now, you can say, well, Dave, do you have an example of this? Well, yes, I do. Hopefully it'll work. Okay, now this, I got to say, this is a tisk moment from Global, okay? So, notice I'm trying to pick on everybody, on some level, we've taken swipes of CBC, CTV, now we're on to Global. Okay, I want everybody to read this headline here. Okay, man who attended Ottawa protest convoy arrested on firearms charges. Now, when you look at that, you think, wow, he's at the convoy and he's been arrested on firearms charges. No. If you read the article, and thankfully they're at least honest in the article, what happened was he had been caught on video waving a firearm around in Nova Scotia 1 month previous, and he was arrested that particular time, taken into the police office for questioning. He hadn't been found guilty yet. To my understanding, there hadn't been even a trial yet, if there was one at all. But the headline reads what the headline reads, and it's capitalizing off the deliberate ambiguity involved here. And so this is something I find on some level just like, wow, there was nobody who could be more honest than that? Really? But mind you, if they said, man found at the convoy was arrested a month ago, they might go, so? The average reader, who cares, Maybe he was caught in mischief, I don't know. Maybe he was fishing out of season, I don't know. Would it be really, really relevant to that particular point in time? But if you frame the headline this way, guess who goes to look at it? Well, dumb guys like me. But I wanted to check it out. I wanted to see who this bad boy was, if he was just an outrageous, out of control, firearm-waving lunatic in the middle of Ottawa. I wanted to know. What I found was so utterly boring and dull that I thought, thank you, God, that'll be a great one for the actual Faith and Politics 4. Because really, when you look at it, on one basis, is that really relevant when you're, and even if you, a credible person, I think, would look at that and say, guys, that's not relevant. That's just ganging up on somebody for the sake of making the people in Ottawa look bad or whatever. And of course, I suppose that could be the motivation. If you want to discredit something, this is one of the ways that you kind of can do it subtly. But once again, I think, let's be aware that Satan is subtle. The liar of all lies, the father of all lies, he's not just crass and obvious. He's very, very subtle at times. And I think that's why we have to pay attention to the subtleties of media, because we're being fed messages in some ways that, if we're not very conscious of it, can lead to our own unnecessary bias in a situation that is thoroughly unwarranted. Like, there are times now, guys, I gotta be honest, I am so grateful it takes months and months to go through the court of law. Because at least that way, everybody's got months and months to think about it. And not just respond like sometimes the public square does, or the court of public opinion does, with respect to something that is actually irrelevant to the case. And there are things being purported in media that are simply irrelevant to the actual objective reality involved. They're trying to do a certain thing. They're trying to make a certain message fly, but basically they're doing it in ways that are very dishonest at times, if there's actually intent here. I mean, obviously, this could just be a stupid mistake. Okay, I acknowledge that. It could be a stupid mistake. But at the same time, how does a stupid mistake get onto a national, newspaper picked up, or, a national website that's picked up as a global national, and this obvious, bizarre kind of, nothingness story becomes something larger given the reality of what's happening in Ottawa? It's hard for me to believe that wouldn't be deliberate. I gotta be frank. It's hard for me to believe that. And I think that underneath that is a certain bias. I believe they're trying to make some people look bad. And this is the way you do it. Because some people will just read the headline and then they'll go off saying, yeah, some lunatic was waving his gun in Ottawa. No, that's not what happened. Thankfully, a court of law could work that out. But honestly, why does everything have to be worked out in the court of law? That's the question. Yeah. So, okay, how about this one? Kind of along a similar timeline and issue. Okay, complicity in doxing. I've mentioned this to private individuals. I apologize if you're going to hear me sort of blither on about this one. Okay, but a Christian crowdfunding site, Give, Send, Go, is illegally hacked. That's what happened this past week. Is illegally hacked, and the names of the donors to the Ottawa Freedom Convoy are publicized on the web. Okay. Now, instead of, delegitimizing the hack, as an editor who had integrity might, they might say, we're not publishing any of those names because that's just simply an attempt to smear. And not only is it an attempt to smear, it's an attempt to dox. Now, that word is relatively new, but it just means to publish your information so that others can harass you and intimidate you. Okay? So doxing happens when somebody says, yeah, this politician really irks me. Here's his address, folks. And here's the names of his family, right? And it looks, pretty dicey on some level, right? Well, that's what doxing is. And so if you're not familiar with the term, that's what it's. It's a particularly targeted, publicized harassment where you publicize people's home addresses, or other private information of theirs, just to actually get them scared or to intimidate them. Well, in this case, Global and others like them could have chosen not to publish the names of either the companies involved or the individuals involved. Now, I am pleased to say that the individuals involved were safe. They didn't publish, but they didn't have a problem with publishing companies, even if they were just small companies. So there was an actual ice cream establishment in downtown Ottawa that had to close its doors because it got threatened with bricks through the windows and everything else because she donated $250 to the truck convoy. And so you shut a business down, you send all your employees away because you can't take a chance that there won't be bricks flying through the air and people getting hurt in your chair, on the seats by the window. And so why Global and others would want to publicize the names of these companies? And there was another publicized named company from Langley that was named in this. And I thought, why are you playing the hackers' rules? Like, why are you playing by their rules? You could have just generically said that they published both company names and these names were all over Canada or whatever, or most of them came from the prairies or something. You could have said something in general like that if you'd wanted to run a story on this. But I think hopefully, why wouldn't you also at the same time say, we categorically disrespect the whole idea of hacking to gain information from donors to what can be, in essence, charitable enterprises. So now, you've got a Christian crowdfunding site that has to like triple its security in terms of what it needs to do in order to actually make sure that doesn't happen again, to achieve the confidence level back, and all because GoFundMe decided that they would stop giving at all to this. And then we have the whole thing that gets involved out of that politically, which is in some ways deeply disturbing. But like I say, if we're just going to strictly speak to the media issue here, is that Global and other companies did not have to publish names here. So the question becomes, why did they? Why? Because from the standpoint of love your neighbor as yourself, would you want your company's name publicized by, out in the thin air to people that are going to be looking on that site in order to make a point? Like, it's not just like you're giving out information in a benign context. That being said, the church here doesn't splatter the names of all its donors either. Like, we don't do that, right? So why would this be done in a media sense, except in some sort of weird way to capitalize off the hack, to capitalize off the crime, and intimidate people for political reasons? I think that's highly suspect as a motivation. Now, there's more in this particular case, so I'm gonna move forward here to the next, because we've got an anti-Christian bias here. So, in the same case of that illegal hacking of the Christian crowdfunding site Give, Send, Go, American media, Vice Media, now it's kind of Can-Am, like it has one executive officer who was actually born in Ottawa. But they published certain details which the CBC now, this isn't Global, but the CBC picked up in Canada, and it was pleased to repeat. And this is interesting. What kind of details did they want to repeat at the CBC? Well, they wanted to name the fact that there were 92,000 donors to the trucking convoy. And there were other details as well, like there were slightly more American contributors than Canadian, but the Canadian contributors contributed more money than the Americans. So it was kind of a toss-up as to who contributed more. But then actually Vice specifically wanted to let us know this, that 13,000 donors included references to God or to Jesus in their messages for the project. Hallelujah, yeah. I doubt it's Vice saying that, but you're looking at this and say, okay, now why did Vice feel the need to tell us how religious the donors were, a certain percentage of them were, in this case? Well, I don't know exactly. I can speculate, but I think in some respects it is curious to me that both the CBC and Vice Media, both of which are pretty well known as bastions of the left politically, would find this particular detail worth printing. And I think in some ways they want to send a message that people who are demonstrative in their faith are somehow a threat to society. That's what I think is going on. Because, I've read some statistics from other sources in years gone by that talk about just how few Christians there are in journalism schools. It's not necessarily the bastion of Christian thought that it might be. And as a net result, sometimes it certainly looks like it from, when you take a look at iPolitics, for example, if you go onto their site or follow their stories on Facebook, they're pretty central to Ottawa. Well, they have a little bit wider audience now, but they certainly don't like it when I comment on behalf of the Evangelical Office of Public Square on some of their postings. I mean, there are people who are kind of into mocking laughter no matter what I say, because they see the name and they just hit that mocking laughter emoji, and that's fine. I follow them because there are stories on there that are of religious interest, and they'll get columns as well occasionally from mostly points of view that I wouldn't personally connect with, but nevertheless editorialists that are on the progressive Christian side of things. But by and large, not necessarily friendly territory at all. And I think it's pretty obvious on some level that evangelicals have a little bit more respect in their voicing in some more conservative news sites than they do in some of those that are common to Ottawa itself or in the mainstream media proper. So that's a little bit about that case that was problematic for sure. And I guess in some ways I've got to contrast this. Given that the CBC's interest was in finding out just how many convoy donors referenced Jesus or God in their giving, it is curious that it was actually conservative Canadian media, True North News, not CTV or Global, that kept actually a running tally last summer on the number of Christian churches being vandalized or razed to the ground by arson in the summer of 2021. So, you can tell that they're interested in the conservative media of at least following the abuse that happens on church property with respect to various issues in the aftermath of the Kamloops Residential School burial ground issue that came up. A burial issue that has not been resolved yet by any substantive evidence. And yet 65 churches were either completely burned to the ground or vandalized significantly, including our own denomination as well. So in that sense, it's odd that you get this favor from one group and this disfavor from another. I just put that to you, and that's why I suggest watch them both. Watch them both, and then compare and contrast them. Okay, so I want to bring down now, as we close, to what time are we looking at anyway? We're doing okay? Oh, mercy. This is the shortest PowerPoint, but it's the longest thing. Anyway, funny how that works. Anyway, I just want to mention a couple of things. I did have one experience on CBC that I want to bring to bear right now, as just a brief story to it. In 1997, the former moderator of the United Church of Canada, a man by the name of Bill Phipps, he was from Calgary, basically said he didn't believe that Jesus was God. Okay? So there was a big kerfuffle. It was actually even a national kind of issue on some level, so much so that actually at the time, CBC actually wanted to cover something on it. Now, it just so happened they'd invited a friend of mine from Brandon, Manitoba, who was an evangelical United Church pastor and would not have been in favor with the statement made by the moderator of the United Church of Canada, to actually come onto camera and basically defend his position of why Bill Phipps had actually hurt the church and offended folks and whatever. And unfortunately, he had a clash that he could not get out of, and he couldn't go into the Brandon studio might have existed. He might have had to go into Winnipeg. I'm not really sure. But in any case, he couldn't access the Manitoba particular branch of the CBC that he needed to get filmed for CBC Midday, which used to be that news program that was on at noon. That was for years it was there as a kind of a program that CBC was always marketing. So he called me. I was in eastern Saskatchewan. Southeastern Saskatchewan, and he asked me if I could do it. So I said, okay, I'll give it a go. I don't know how it'll go. I'm going to ask you guys for prayer, because I don't know how it's going. And then I headed in a November day to the studios of CBC in Regina. Except I never really got to the studios of CBC in Regina because I was directed outside, where they were going to be filming me in November in Regina, and the snow was beginning to fall. And okay, I'm new at this. I don't know what their problem is. Maybe all the studios are booked up or whatever. And so I get filmed outside in the weather, a typical November day with gray everywhere, right? And I'm talking to this person on the other end that I can't see. There's no monitor I can follow. And that other person is former national moderator for the United Church of Canada, Bruce MacLeod, who was certainly radicalized enough, by my standard, to agree with Bill Phipps. So in that sense, he was there to defend the United Church's position, and I was there to sort of say, hey, you know what, it was way over the top, it should never have happened. And so basically that's how the interview went. They had us go back and forth between the two, and it worked out okay. You know, it wasn't too bad in terms of how it worked out. It could have been a lot worse, in my opinion. I didn't see how this looked until I got home, by the way, because I'd asked Barry to record it. A recording that I tried to find for today. I think it may be in some box somewhere. Either that or I've accidentally recorded over it. Oh well. But in any case, you could have seen me with a lot darker hair and a little bit thicker as well. But in any case, when I got home, I saw that the other interviewed person, Bruce MacLeod, was in a Toronto studio with one of those kind of background where everything looks like cushy. You could almost have had library books, you know, where you pull them out and read them, that type of thing in the background. It was just like unbelievable. And there I was sort of in the cold, barely able to sort of see my way. And the thought occurred to me at the time, you know, when you just want to say, okay, stop it right there. What am I watching here? And what has happened here in terms of this? Because these choices may have been deliberate. In which case, why don't we ask the question, is psychology in play in news media studios in terms of how they frame a discussion? This is one thing that we don't necessarily talk about, but how a discussion is framed often makes the difference in a discussion. It's like when people, when the BC Court of Law, and this is a harsh example maybe, but when the BC Court of Law basically says, in a discussion about transgendered ideology, we're going to force the defense or the actual prosecution to only use the language that the actual transgender person wants to use. Do you see a problem there? When they tried that same thing in the United States in a particular jurisdiction, the judge said to them, no, because that's prejudicial to the case. If you use their language, what you're saying is that the judge already agrees with that side. So in that situation, instead of using the language of the common, the status quo, the language of the radicalized is chosen. Well, you already know what the decision's going to be, right? So there's a problem, and there is an issue in how we frame things. And psychologically, I think there probably are media personnel who know how to frame. And they know how to actually play the most subtle games of all, the psychological games in terms of what does the ambiance transmit in terms of information that the viewer is taking in without really knowing that they're taking it in. It's almost like it's subliminal in a sense. And I began to probe that issue. And I noticed as well that when it came to the issue of gay marriage, for example, within the church, the United Church at the time, every time the CBC would interview somebody on that, if they were interviewing the people who wanted to be included, they would choose a kitchen. They would choose hearth and home because they wanted to project normalcy in the midst of that debate. So the lesbian couple is cooking dinner, making it look normal. They aren't being interviewed in a gay bar. That wouldn't help their cause. So they're actually being interviewed inside hearth and home where everybody feels safe, and basically everyone feels this is normal. And this, once again, these are the framers of the media. They actually frame the set and the ambiance that you see. And out of that, they actually are projecting a message in and of itself of where they are, even if they're projecting it very, very subtly. So the last thing I want to mention in terms of media is watch for those subtleties in even set design and the ambiance that's involved. You know, what does the class, in my situation, I had a guy comfortable in the indoors versus me kind of going, can I even see? I can barely hear the guy in my ear, you know, talking, and I'm straining even to try to make sense of the data I'm getting, and I'm being filmed at the same time as that's going on. Well, that's going to make me look more like I'm under duress. It's going to make my opposition look like, wow, you know, bring in the clowns, this is awesome, you know, and everything else like this. And as a net result, I think there's this imbalance that gets projected even in the set design, if you will, of the actual media interview? I'll take your question, sure.
Do you have the Broad Street traffic too in the background?
I don't think so. But these are the kind of things you wonder about. Because the playing field isn't necessarily level when it comes to these interviews if the producer doesn't want it to be level. And I'm reminded of this because years later, I actually had an opportunity, a sit-down meal, to say to a producer, a news producer, I believe a CTV in this case, and I said to him, how do you choose what stories run? He didn't know who I was. He didn't know that I was a pastor. So I asked him, how do you choose? And he said, by and large, it's two things. If it tugs at your heart or basically tugs at your wallet. And that's how I choose what stories run at 6 o'clock on the news. Now, is there something particularly manipulative or pernicious about that? No. But it does show you this. It shows you I have a framework by which I discover or not, or accept or reject the stories that come to me. And so a story that might be a human interest story that doesn't particularly tug at the heart and doesn't have financial implications might be important, from the standpoint of Christian belief, it might be terribly important. But if it doesn't make the grade on that basis, it doesn't run. That's the framework, right? So, when I ask the question, does a kitchen speak? Yes, it does. So there's just some closing statements I want to make here. As mentioned, in a secular society, the role of the media is prophetic, to be a public truth teller, even when confronting power. Yet when absent or when the media fails to uphold this trust, the truth-telling task may actually fall to the church. The church may have to become the substitute media in an area where the compromise is large enough. So I just want you to bear in mind the implications of that. And perhaps that's why it's no coincidence that the American First Amendment manages to honor both press and religious freedom in the same clause. Second, given the fact that when we talk about monopoly, the government by nature is a monopoly. It has certain levels, but it is a monopoly. It's not like there are 2 or 3 governments you get to choose from. Maybe some would prefer it, there might be at this juncture. Given that fact, and given the fact that there is a political risk to society that increases whenever the media is in the hands of fewer and fewer players, especially if it doesn't have much interest anymore in prophetic truth, then actually it tends to cater more and more to the interests of the powerful. So there's an implication there that we need to understand very closely as well. And at the point where media is most interested in power and when it has the greatest monopoly, that is where the threat to the public objective truth becomes the greatest. It is at this point where freedom of speech becomes increasingly critical to society and is increasingly seen as a potential threat at the same time. And furthermore, it is at this point where the church may become the primary custodian of such important constitutional freedoms. Because if the media is failing its task and the church has to come and step up, we're going to be the ones targeted for freedom of speech issues on a greater and greater scale. So there's some implication there. So I just want to end with this one statement, just so you know, because I think this is why freedom of speech is important, and yet I want to be clear. I, personally, do not defend free speech as a means to justify vulgarity, obscenity, bigotry, perjury, slander, or blasphemy. I defend free speech for one reason alone. It is the principled means by which the most precious speech of all is culturally defended, that of prophetic truth in the public square. Okay, so do you understand me on that? Did I go too far forward on that one? Did you see that statement as I was reading it? Okay, see, that's what I'm saying, is that you don't have to justify everything that you see speech-wise, but you still should be committed to free speech, because the most important speech of all, the one that really gets up the craw when it really matters, is the prophetic truth. And as the church becomes the sole custodian of prophetic truth because the media fails in its duties, the pressure becomes intensified on the church, and the responsibilities to actually declare what needs to be declared also gets magnified. And so I would like really people to really understand this. It's not that we actually are justifying vulgarity or blasphemy or anything like that. But the one thing that I think needs to be protected in the middle of all that entourage of nonsense is the public truth. And for that reason, the church has got to be there in the public. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we give you thanks for this day. We give you thanks, O Lord, for this time. We ask your blessing upon it, that we'd learn the lessons that we need to do, and that our eyes might be opened, O Lord, and you might help us, O God, as we examine the media in our time. And Father, too, I pray that if the church is to become the biggest custodian of prophetic truth in society, I pray that you might strengthen her to do her task and strengthen the people here tonight for this very reality. And I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.